Okay. So here we go. An energetic and systemic revealing is the subtitle here, because it's not just about one person. It's about that one person in the context of the system that he or she lives in. So when we do workshops, we spend quite a bit of time at first to create a space in which we can work, because it is a very embodied meditative work. And so I just want to encourage you for this moment just to take a minute, look around if you're cozy, if you feel like you won't be disturbed in the next couple of hours, and you feel like you can focus into your own body, because that is really how the work moves through you. And we usually take just a moment to close your eyes and to take a deep breath, and to see if you can drop your exhale a little deeper into your body. Just to still yourself and come as present as possible. Grounding yourself, it helps to bring attention to your sacrum and to your feet, and arrive in this present moment. Just making some space inside for all this information to land. All right, let's go. So the big words for systemic constellation work that came into being is that it works with transgenerational transmission of trauma or ancestral healing. And I just wanted to begin by explaining a little bit, what is that transgenerational transmissions? Basically, what it means is that whatever happens in your system of origin, your family, whatever is unresolved in that family stays in that system's memory. And I'll talk much more about how that happens in a little while. But it's almost like something did not complete itself because it was too overwhelming, it was too much, or whatever else it was too sudden. So these unresolved things move forward in the family system. It's almost as though you have a carry-on luggage bag that has these unresolved things in it, and we carry them. And in our lifetime, we have a chance to open that bag and unpack it and clear it out. Or maybe we don't. And if we don't, when we pass away, that luggage stays in our home and our descendants will find it and carry it forward. It's an unconsciously picked up luggage bag. Nobody thinks about this. It's something that's lodged in the system of your family. In constellations, we work a lot with the theme of belonging, which means we identify with our group. And we're very, very loyal to our family. Not always consciously, but we'll see again and again in constellations how children will do just about anything to help their parents, to help their system, to move things and take on burdens if necessary. So what we're doing in the work is we're first of all tracing the roots, and then we're working with healing it. We're looking at, where is this thing that's in the room now, this energy, this feeling, this problem, this issue, where is it coming from? Where does it originate? And once we find it, we can start doing the healing work there in the original place, not 2 generations later. I'm going to give you a few examples throughout the talk because it's much more easy to understand what I'm talking about when you hear an example. So, for example, there's Phobia of Supermarkets. So this was a constellation I did in Israel. I was invited there to teach a few times. And there was a young woman who came up and she said, I have a phobia of supermarkets. I can't go into supermarkets. Can you help me with that? And in a constellations, we usually start with an interview, a chat. What's it about? What happens when you think about a supermarket? So I asked her about her feelings going in, and it was all the signs of trauma. Her heart rate picked up, she got nauseous, she felt dizzy, she just couldn't get herself to go into these larger supermarkets. It was easier in smaller ones, but in the larger ones, she got completely overwhelmed. And when I asked her, well, what do you think of when you hear supermarket? And she kept saying, there's so much food, so much food. And that made me sit with that. And my next question was, who did not have enough food? And the moment I asked her that, she burst into tears and she shared with us that her grandmother starved to death in the Holocaust. So within one question, we went from her fear to an actual event 2 generations before. And this was actually a very simple constellation. And I'll talk more about how we do constellations. We use representatives, or other people call it resonators, someone who steps into the shoes of these 2 people. So we had someone standing in for her grandmother, someone standing in for her in that field. And really, there was a lot of grief around this fate of her grandmother. She grieved, she cried, and she needed her grandmother's blessing to have as much food as she wanted. So once the grieving was moved through a little more, we simply asked the representative to ask the grandmother, can you please give me your blessing if I have as much food as I want to right now? And the grandmother was more than happy to give that blessing. And then the second healing sentence from the grandmother was, this was my fate. Please leave it with me. And with that, there was a relaxation in the room and a letting go on the part of this person. And I didn't follow up. One of the beautiful things about constellations is I sometimes never see these folks again, but I'm pretty sure that that resolved a big chunk of her issue. So there's a very simple first example. Let me just stop here and see if there anything to that wants to be said or asked. You can just unmute yourself. That may be the easiest way to do that.
I have a question. Are certain people more likely to pick up the family trauma? If you're more sensitive, if you're more X or Y or Z?
It's usually everybody who picks it up, but it gets divided in a family system. And people who are more sensitive in general feel their feelings more clearly. So it may look like they carry a lot more, but I don't think so. I think it gets pretty well divvied up in family systems. Anything else? Mara, go forward here.
Yeah, I was just going to ask whether you had someone stand in the place of the grandmother and someone else stood in the place of the person who was phobic, or you use the person who was phobic in the constellation.
No, we don't. We always use a representative at first, because if you stand yourself in there, you can understand it. If you stand yourself in there, you're in there with all your thought forms, all your narratives, it's very hard to truly listen to your energetic currents without your mind interfering. So we usually use a representative for the first phase of a constellation, which is the diagnostic phase. because that other person has no interest, has no bias, has no story in their head. It's much easier for them to follow the energetic pathways. And then when it's clearing, or when the healing sentences need to happen, like by the time we went to please give me your blessing, then the real person stands in. So the second stage, where it's the healing stage of the work, we can often bring in the client itself. In the end, almost always the client stands in themselves.
If I resolve an issue or a process myself, does that actually change for my children, or do they still carry it even though I've resolved it?
Oh, that is the beauty of it. The beauty of it, that if you resolve it, for one, heals backwards to where the actual conflict was. And for two, if you clear it, you do not pass it forward. That's the beauty of this work, that it really, in the present moment, gets to clear out both some of the past and heal forward into the future. And depending on who you work for example, I had one woman who was coming in for her 3-year-old little daughter who had panic attacks. And she didn't know what to do for her daughter. So we did a piece of work which ended up being all about the woman. It was her issues that were coming up, her family issues coming into her body. The child was just picking up the fears. And so once she did the work, that child never had another panic attack. So it can be very healing for the next generation. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go forward. We can ask more in a bit. So what I'm doing now is I'm giving you a little bit of an overview of some things. I call that eagle medicine because we're looking from high above right now. We're looking at values, thought forms, kind of like an overview situation. And just to give us a language that we all understand equally, because it's easier to speak about some of these processes when we have the same language. So the first statement is life has an inbuilt movement towards balance and healing. And to me, that is incredibly important because it makes it very clear we are not doing the healing here. We are not the ones who are clearing everything out and healing. All we're doing is we're looking at what's in the way of healing. We're trying to find the obstacles that we're trying to clear out of the way so that life can do what it does, heal and balance and move forward. And the way I think of it is that it's kind of like energy flowing through form, right? So life is transmitted through our bodies and through the bodies of everything alive. And for this moment, if you can just substitute the word energy with the word light, because I'm using imagery from electricity to make this easier understandable. So if you think of light flowing through our bodies, through our life forms, and for humans, the transmission we're talking about goes through our nervous system. We're actually working with light moving through our nervous system all the time. And that is very much like an electrical current that flows through the electrical lines in our house. And I'm using that as an image to understand what happens. Because much like in our houses, whether we have a breaker system, we have a panel that if anything becomes dangerous or overloaded or overwhelmed, the breaker switches and the whole house goes dark because we don't want the danger of the house burning down. Well, our nervous system also has such an inbuilt system. And our nervous system that has developed over very, very many generations, and there is a part of our brain that takes over when we are in moments of trauma or of shock or of utter overwhelm. So some part of our brain kicks in. It's a much older part of our brain because it's been around for a long time to help us survive. We're calling it the reptilian brain. When that moves in and takes over, it applies these very long-standing patterns that have served well for human survival, which is fight, flight, or freeze. Most of you will be familiar with those. And I'm just giving you a very brief input here on what happens there, because that's in many ways what we end up picking up in the constellation work. So when that breaker gets tripped, we leave our normal range of our nervous system wave. You see in the middle here, this green wave here, that is our normal range of a balanced nervous system. When we hang out in that range between the red sympathetic nervous system and the blue parasympathetic nervous system, we're hanging out in the middle there. We feel balanced, we feel we have choice, we're fairly relaxed, we can be fluid. So here there is an open, curious mind, and we can be more activated. The sympathetic nervous system gets us activated, motivated, active, or we may be more in a restful place and closer to the parasympathetic, like down here, where we're more in a, okay, time to relax, time to get ready for rest, sort of a coming down into a more slow functioning nervous system. So that's the normal range. And we do get deregulated pretty regularly. So the black line shows the deregulation. Sometimes the adrenaline shoots up and we get overregulated and we're too anxious and too restless and too active, or we go lower and we're tired and sleepy and can't quite get ourselves going. So it's not a problem to get dysregulated as long as we can re-regulate ourselves. The problem sits when we get stuck in either an on position, which you see up on the red. That means we're chronically anxious, active, restless. We're chronically overcharged, too busy. We can't sleep, and it can even go into hostility and rage. So we're stuck in that place. We don't know how to get out of that place. That's the stuck on position. And the opposite is the stuck off position. So stuck on is fight or flight, and stuck off is freeze, which means I can't get myself motivated. I can't get going. I feel depressed. I can't function well. I may have low blood pressure, poor digestion, and feel tired all the time. So that's the stuck off position. Now, in both of those positions, energy cannot move. That light cannot flow. It starts to stagnate. And that's where things begin that we bring into the constellation work. We use the concept there of the hungry ghosts, which is really a concept that comes out of Tibetan Buddhism. And if you haven't yet seen it, I highly recommend Gabor Mate's film, The Wisdom of Trauma. He just does a beautiful job showing these hungry ghosts in action in people's lives. So hungry ghosts are those places that froze, that got stuck, that never got processed. And if you go back to understanding that everything waits to be noticed. The hidden wants to be seen before it can relax. So what isn't moved and processed cannot let go. But if you are born in a generation that was traumatized, for example, my parents and grandparents were born during were alive during World War II. And what happened there was so overwhelming, so completely traumatizing, that this generation could not process it. Many barely survived it. So now what hasn't been processed, what's hidden, that load will be passed down to the next generation. And that is where we start to work with hungry ghosts. And I'm really happy that I can now tell you that it is passed down through the DNA. We now have proof of that, and I'll talk to that soon. And also, of course, it gets passed down through how a culture adapts to all of that, which nobody could handle. Always makes me think of Harry Potter, the one who can't be named. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. The things that cannot be brought into the light because they're too scary, they're too intense. Those are the hungry ghosts. And in moments of trauma, when the information has to get shut down, then the houses stay dark, that light cannot flow, and the trauma stays unconscious. And we in our body go numb. There are places in our body that will simply go numb. And what cannot move stagnates. So it gets frozen, goes numb or dark. And because we're not present in those places in our body, that's why we call them absences. So hungry ghosts are really absent places in ourselves at this point. And to make that a little more understandable, I'm going to give you an example of my own history, just briefly here. So, born in Germany, 1958, so 13 years after World War II. What happened during World War II was so overwhelming. So many people lost so much. Houses were rubble. After the war ended, all this information about concentration camps was revealed, which was horrible for anybody in Germany that they were part of all of that. So the only way people could move forward is they built such a wall. They started saying, we're starting again. And they tried to close down everything that happened before. And it almost felt like it's kind of like a memo went out in all of Germany that we're not talking about this. We cannot handle this. Of course, that was never spoken. But growing up in post-war Germany, I did not hear anything about World War II until I was 17 years old. That's how long that silence needed to stay maintained, because people had to move forward. They couldn't handle what happened behind them. And so what you see here are two levels. One is what each person themselves carries in their family system from that unresolved time, the personal trauma, this family trauma, and then the collective trauma of the whole country. And that's what I meant earlier by cultural adaptations. Our cultures and countries also have to find a way to move forward in time after massive trauma. We'll make another break here to see if there are any questions to what we've had so far.
I just wanted to say I see a parallel with what's happening in our country right now without being political. With the deaths that we're all exposed to or were directly exposed to one way or another. With COVID, it's I don't mean to compare it to World War II, but there is a trauma in this country when we look at what's been happening.
Absolutely. What we're having is a collective trauma going down worldwide at the moment. So it's definitely a major event. The question is, how much can we process it and process how we feel about it and move through our own process with it? Because what's interesting is that this trauma isn't necessarily what happens. Trauma is what cannot get processed. And often trauma is what you are too alone to bear and move through you. So that's also an interesting thing to see how can we spend time and ways at this time to not make this another major absencing event with lots of hungry ghosts. But that goes into the collective trauma bubble, which is another piece of work that also comes into the constellation work, but not on this level right now. Anything else before I go on?
I have something that is interesting. I don't remember who is being interviewed, who these two people were being interviewed by, and you might be familiar with it. There was a mother and a daughter. The mother was from Germany and was Jewish and was a great musician and came over here and said, you know, enough. I want to bring up my children in this beautiful way. And the daughter, who was at that time on the video, like 50 something, was a mess with the trauma.
Yes.
So that's interesting because actually the mother had a very good life after.
Yes.
She started her. And so it would, in some sense, give me the impression that, oh, it works. If you think to just move on.
Right. It
Yeah.
looks like it works, but the
It
next
does.
generation, and I remember that interview. I actually use
Oh,
it.
you do? Yeah.
It's on my website. It's Thomas interviewing them at one
Oh.
of our Celebrate Life festivals. So
Oh.
the story is a little bit, the woman survived Auschwitz because she was a musician. And
Right.
it's a little more complicated because the musicians in those days, there wasn't any television. And the people in the concentration camps wanted to have music. They wanted concerts on Sundays. So those who played an instrument got better treatment. They got more to eat.
Mm.
They survived easier. So she survived because she played the cello. And she did what you just said. She said, enough of this. She built that wall
Mhm.
and said, I'm never going to think about it, talk about it. So her daughter, when she grew up, she saw the tattoo on her mother's arm. And she thought how weird that she would have a telephone number on her arm. That's how little she knew about her mother's history. And she developed all the symptoms. She had eating disorders. She was a hoarder. She developed all the things that come out of not, what the mother's trauma lived through. The daughter had the symptoms. And so it's very interesting to have that conversation. And I don't know if you remember, but the third generation, the grandson, picked up the cello and played the cello with his grandmother until 32.
Yes.
And then he put it away and never touched it again. So he also was tied into the trauma cycle. So
yes.
yeah, so there are many, many examples of the collective and the personal.
Yes. So, it makes me feel like one thing that needs to switch in us all is it's not just about us.
Right. Well, that's part of constellation.
Right?
We start to see it's not just all about us. And that's, again, in the indigenous, there's the saying, you have to look 7 generations behind you and
Yes.
7 generations in front of you if you want the full picture.
Yeah.
And even in the Bible, there's a statement, it takes 7 generations to undo your father's sins. So none of it is new, but we are. So let me move forward another round here. I wanted to share a little bit with how does this transmission happen? Because that's always in the workshops, there's always a question, how can this be possible? How is this possible that it, moves forward? And I'm so happy now that there are people in this world who are patient enough and diligent enough to do this research, because when I started doing the work, many people did not believe that trauma gets passed forward. And through the gene pool, they just did not believe that was true. We now have a whole science called epigenetics that can prove the changes in the DNA when trauma is passed forward. And so there are plenty of experiments. I'm just very briefly giving you 2 because I'm not the researcher, but it'll give you a little bit of a understanding of how it works. So the main one was a Harvard study where they did an experiment with mice, as psychologists so often do. And those poor mice were put in a cage, and the cage had a wiring in it so it could conduct electroshock. And what they did is they put in the smell of cherry blossom. And after that smell, shortly thereafter, the mice would get an electric shock, small shock. And they did that only 3 times. But after that, anytime those mice smelled cherry blossom smell, they showed all signs of trauma, and they were terrified, and they were expecting to be shocked again. And then they let those mice breed, and they took the pups away from the parents as soon as they were born. And when later, when they were grown, they put in the smell of cherry blossoms, those little mice had the same exact reaction. They were terrified. They showed every sign of trauma and expected this electroshock, even though they weren't even alive when this happened. And they did that for 3 generations later, and each time saw that reaction to the smell in the next generation. So clearly that had passed itself forward as an alarm signal for the animals to beware something terrible is going to happen now. And that made people go, well, it must have been passed down through the DNA because there was no external exposure to any of the stimuli. The second study that has been going on since World War II from in England and Germany is done with descendants of World War II, both perpetrator descendants, so ancestors were Nazis or worked in concentration camps or were clearly in the perpetrator role, and also descendants of victims who had suffered. And in those studies that are now 3 or 4 generations by now, I would guess, there were also very clear indications that those who lived as victims, descendants, had a much higher index of fear, suspicion, vigilance in their body systems than a normal group. And those who were descendants of perpetrators were more prone to fight, to argue, to defend. So it's hard to call that aggression, but they certainly were much more, had a higher rate of that energy of defense and aggression. So these are the experiments that are out there, and they're much more explicit than I'm making it here, but it gives you an idea of that there is now data that shows that what we're doing in the transgenerational transmission exploration is actually proven scientifically as real. So the big question is always, how on earth does that work? And how does it work in a constellation that someone steps into the shoes of someone else and experiences something there? How would they know what that person experiences? How would that information be available? And after 20 years of doing this, I can only say that I trust that field explicitly. I trust it more than what people say to me in the constellations. In the constellation, what we call it the knowing field, because of that, because it seems to have the information of the system in it. The history of the system is recorded in it somehow. And this word, the morphogenetic field, is something that was coined by Rupert Sheldrake. He's a British biologist, and he tried to explore this kind of field, for example, in many animal species, like how do, in a school of fish, how do they all know that they turn at the same moment? How are they connected? Or a flock of geese, how do they all know where to go and how to go? And where do they get this information simultaneously in the same moment? So he began working to explore this field that we also work in the constellation world. You can think of it as an invisible organizing field that holds information. And it holds it all honestly. So as we saw in what we just talked about, there are hungry ghosts that we don't even know are there, but they're there in this field and they show up in this field. And that's how we can work with it. Because history is often not that recorded in our history books. We leave out what we can't deal with. We don't have a lot of that in our curriculum sometimes. We don't want to deal with some of the difficult situations. So that's just our nature of trying to move on in life. So, but in that field, it is going to be present and visible. Yeah. So you can think of it as a blueprint or a matrix for form, behavior, or beliefs. And here I'm going to tell you another example. This is a constellation I did in the Unitarian Church in Belmont. And it was very interesting because there was, you know, the minister and the cantor and the music director, and we were all sitting there. They wanted to learn what this is. And I just asked, well, is anyone here willing to explore it? Because I don't usually speak this much about constellations. I usually just give people an experience. This is a whole new experience for me to teach before I do. So in that workshop, a woman came up and said, well, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I want to see what happens because we were very close until she was 15. And now she's 16 and we barely talk to each other. And my first reaction was honestly saying, I don't think this is a transgenerational issue. I think this is a developmental issue. You know, teenagers need to individuate and separate. She probably needs to get away from you, and this is how she does it. But then the woman said, but the same happened to me and my mother. I was close until I was 15. And at 16, we got into this hostile, angry thing, and we still barely speak to each other now. And that made it really clear this is more than a developmental issue. So in this constellation, we had, you know, mother and daughter. And yes, there it was. I don't want anything to do with you. I'm mad at you. I don't like you. And then I brought in the grandmother. And when the mother turned around to her, it was the same exact feeling. I don't want anything to do with you. I'm really angry with you. And that went on for several generations. However, transgenerationally, the daughter liked her grandmother in both cases. So, and the grandmother liked the granddaughter. So it was like this, here we don't like each other, here we're close again. It's like a step up between. So we looked for where this came from. It went back 3 generations, same exact dynamic. And then I said, what happened? Do you know what happened to her mother? And there was a silence, and she was thinking about that far back. And then she said, oh, that mother lived in Ireland during the potato famine. She lost 2 children to starvation in that time. And then she gathered every resource she could to put her one daughter on a boat at age 15. And she sent her off to America to some distant uncle that the daughter didn't even know. And that was the break. And the moment she shared that information, it arrived in the room. And that's the magic of constellations. When you find it, everybody knows we found it in the room. Because here was the 15-year-old furious with her mother to be sent away from everything she knew, everybody she loved, to some boat, to some guy she's never met. She was furious with her mother. And so here we were with a mother who then started saying, there wasn't a day in my life I didn't think about you. And started oozing out how much she loved this daughter and had grieved for her when she was gone. And the whole room was crying at that point because it was so clear that she'd sent her daughter away for love. And slowly, slowly, this anger, this mad began to melt. And it took a while for this daughter to see that her mother actually loved her, that this wasn't a betrayal, that this was an act of love. And so this is then where the healing begins, and where slowly we could have the work happen that this daughter could come home to her mother and reconnect there, belong there, be home again. And that's a reconnection into her lineage, into her country. And once that reconnection could happen, and the healing could happen, then the daughter can turn around and look now at her descendant. And very often in those moments, the words we hear are something like, it's as if I see you for the first time. Because before I saw you, but I also always saw the mother who sent me away. So now I can see you as a mother who has the full support of my lineage. It's a very different way to see your daughter. And then the same process repeated. Then this daughter was mad. Yeah, now you say you see me, you haven't seen me all these years. So then we had to do the same process for 3 generations. But then the love could move forwards through the generations. That's the healing movement in that constellation. Any thoughts or questions to that?
May I ask a question, Sundavum?
Yeah, please tell me your names because I don't see you. I just hear
Okay.
a voice.
Yes, I'm Laura, and I'm the one that's right across the town line in Cambridge. So with that particular example, and I've had those experiences myself in constellations where something gets unlocked
Yes.
and then the healing can begin, the sentences can begin. And in my own life, the reason why I'm so passionate about this work is that it's like the healing for me is very quick.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering how the healing, I don't know if you know what ended up happening with this mother who said I was close and then I wasn't. But I have found that even a small piece of work shifts things really quickly for me. And I didn't know if that's like my own field, my individual and collective field, there's just a quickness about it, or is that typical? Or do they need more work on
Right.
the same issue?
It's a fabulous question.
Thank you.
Because it really depends on, so think back on the light flowing through the body. So then there are these numb places where there's no light, right? There's no energy, there's absence, there's the hungry ghost. In this Irish potato famine thing, the grandmother who sent and that event was the hungry ghost. There was the lack of presence of that grief that had to be stuck away somewhere. So when you get that light to flow through, if it really flows through, the issue is finished. Because now it's no longer an issue. Now that woman knows my mother actually loved me and it can heal again. There isn't the need for the anger and the defense and the darkness and all we do to fight or flight or freeze. All of that can let go because we have the connection again. And if that completely happens, the issue is gone. That's the beauty of this. It doesn't always happen instantly. Sometimes people it takes 2, 3, 4 months to really clear through the body and integrate. But when it's fully cleared, that issue is gone. That's different than if an issue is hooked into a habit. So for example, we have issues, let's say there's an alcoholic who's used alcohol to medicate a trauma, right? So now we work the trauma. So the underlying reason why the person's medicated for years, we may have helped solve. But that doesn't mean that the level of habit and what we do, that clears right away. You still have to go to a rehab. You still have to clear your habit and the way you've dealt with it for many, many years. That doesn't necessarily instantly poof and go away. But the reason why you've done it, we may have worked with.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
That distinction.
Yes. And also,
yeah.
that said, let me just finish. Also, that said, it isn't always a full cycle of healing. Sometimes we do one click on the wheel of healing, and that's all the person's nervous system can handle at this moment.
Got it.
Or the group can handle at this moment. So I also have to respect that's how much we can move this today. Let it sit, come back in 6 months or whatever longer time, and we'll see where it's at then, because it moves in your system even after the constellation, and we never know how far it moves in your system. So Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's so brilliant. Thank you so much.
This is Ellen. I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the questions you would ask the person who comes in, and in this case, simplifying it, you might say, generations back, or with your mother, did something happen when you were 15? And if I'm thinking, if you're lucky, you get the story about, oh yes, my grandmother had to send a child away at 15. But if you're asking the question, do you recall anything that might have happened in your family when a daughter was 15? And the person says no, where do you go after that with your questions?
Right. Also, excellent question, because I never ask those kinds of questions. It always starts with what's bothering you right now, because whatever is sitting, who cares what happened 3 generations ago if there's no heaviness in me about it. We don't have to resolve every last thing for the last 10 generations. That's an impossibility anyway. So I always ask, what's your issue right now? What do you bring? What is in your life that you don't know how to move forward with? What do you need here? That's the question. And then I always listen very carefully to the first few sentences, because usually it sort of comes out. And I work with it right from there. I very rarely know where a constellation will go. Very rarely. It's always an exploration. Okay, I have this eating disorder. I have no idea what to do about it. I've tried this, that, and the other. Okay, let's have a representative for the eating disorder and let's see where it moves. Where in the field does it go to the mother's line? Does it go to the father's line? How is it moving in your system? So we don't really ask too much history at first. We ask, what's bothering you? And then there may be questions around, okay, look at that. It's clearly going to your mother's line. Tell me a little bit more about what happened in your mother's history. And I have a little list on my website of questions to look at, which are all questions that usually can indicate an issue. And so sometimes people go through that, but I usually trust the field. I don't talk that much. I put it up and look. And that will tell you. It's a little like working with a bloodhound. You give them a smell of the cloth of the person you're trying to find, and then you let them loose. And so that's what we do. We get a sniff of what the issue is, what the energy is that we're dealing with. And every time you put a system up in the room, you get a feeling for that system. You immediately get a sense of, ooh, this is a scared system, it's tight, or whoa, there's a lot of aggression in the system, or oh, this is sort of a stagnant system. So it's the field that usually informs the movements, not the questions.
And the corollary to that, and I may not be using these words correctly, is when you have a representative, stand up for the ancestor.
Mhm.
Is it a form, and this is the word that may not be the correct word, but that comes to me, is it a form of telepathy, or that somehow that the representative is channeling information from the ancestor?
Right. So I don't like either one of those words.
Right, I'm sure you don't.
And I get it. It looks like that. It sounds like that. And yet the physical experience you have when you're standing, and we can, maybe one of the people who have done this a lot can share in a little while about what that feels like, because it's not a mental download. It's very much, what does my body feel like in this position? And anyone can do this. It's not a particular skill. You do get more competency when you've done it more often, clearly, because you can say, oh, my left leg is numb, or oh, I want to move that way, or I feel really drawn that way. But it is more of a download of, in this place, in this energetic field, this is what it feels like. That's why my colleague who calls it resonators, it's like you stand in this place and you just allow yourself to perceive what is it like in this place. And sometimes you get words, but more often we're looking for emotional sense. Someone gets really sad or really angry, because what we repress or put into our unconscious are most of the times feelings, not so much thoughts. It's mostly feelings we're trying to clear out. Yeah. Is that helpful?
You can clear feelings, I'm sort of reading from this, that are unconscious or unknown, because I can imagine that there are things where a previous generation never passed on the information of why they're
Yes.
feeling this, or so
And
how
that's
do you get back to that, because you might not know that your grandmother had this event happen in her life because she never told your mother, and your mother obviously couldn't tell you. So
exactly.
how does that come to light?
So the way that might look, and again, I want to encourage people to speak who've done this a lot. The way that might look is in the field, one representative. So what you just described, your mother didn't know, but your grandmother had a secret. A lot of what we work with is hungry ghosts are often secrets. They're often things we don't want to tell our children about because we want to protect them. We don't want them to have to know about crazy grandpa or the Nazi uncle. Or, we don't want that to burden our children. So we keep it in the closet. So, but the way it shows up in the field may be that the person who didn't share the secret is looking in one direction, ignoring it. But all of a sudden, two people in the next generation are both looking at the floor. And if everybody looks at the same spot, there's something there. So then we might put a person lying down there that the grandma may still ignore. But all of a sudden, two other people from a different generation start crying and go down to that person and grieving that person. And you see there's a process happening that didn't happen for the grandmother. So it shows itself in the field. Again, that's where history gets recorded in a way that it isn't necessarily in our history books or in our family histories. For example, stillborn children can be a big issue and nobody likes to talk about that. Or the uncle that is in the mental health institution that everybody forgot about and never visited. Those are secrets that are recorded in that field. They show themselves.
I think the leap that's a little bit harder for me is I can understand from an epigenetic point of view, if you had someone in the family as a representative getting this body energy from an ancestor. The harder leap for me is when you're choosing someone outside of the family system who is then experiencing the emotional reverberations of that family's history. That's the hard leap for me.
Right. I totally understand. That makes logical, perfect sense. And maybe someone can speak who's been a representative a lot and share their experience, because
Some Vadum.
Yeah.
We have a request for when will a bathroom break be coming up?
Oh, good idea. We've probably been at it. Okay.
And another question was about past lives.
Okay.
And you wanted people to talk about representing?
Yeah, if you would just share what it was like for you or something
Well,
like that.
actually, I love it when my husband came and he was very skeptical. And when he was representing, one of his legs felt numb and he couldn't figure out why. And he went up to the client afterwards and said, my leg was numb. And the client said, yeah, that relative had a stroke and was numb on that side.
Right.
Totally blew his mind.
Yeah.
It's, I'll share just a little bit about when you stand in for someone. It really is, for me, a very embodied experience. And what's amazing about it is that you don't have to know much about the situation to be picking up on something in the field. And so part of the practice for me has been to really trust what's happening in my body or in my attitude. Like sometimes I'll be like, this is so boring. I'm so disinterested. I don't want to, I'm so resistant to this whole thing, which I'll say to myself, that's not really me usually. So that, it really does take some practice to name actually what's going on for you, because you may not realize that it's not you, it's that you're standing in for somebody in the field.
Right.
And it's just such a good practice in general to be more embodied and in touch with what you're feeling. That's also been part of the experience that's been so rich for me, because I lived so much up here. It's hard to explain. It is actually very hard to explain until you experienced it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so once in a blue moon, I do exchange a representative, because whatever their form of expression is, I'm not sure it's authentic or it fits. I usually check with the client. I watch the client. If it resonates with them, I'll keep moving through with what's happening. But there was one moment where there was a gentleman who just felt nothing through the whole constellation. He didn't move much. He had no reaction. He just stood there going, I feel nothing. I don't know what I'm doing here. He seemed quite disconnected from the constellation. And I chose to leave him in. And as we opened the constellation up, the client said, I mean, that was the perfect representation for my father. It was like he actually, the person chosen who didn't feel anything and didn't connect at all, was actually for her the best representation, because it was so accurate to what she grew up with. So you really never quite know when to move in or out, but it is a very embodied experience for most people. Yeah. So I know we need a bathroom break, and then I can answer the past life question later on in the thing. If I forget, please remind me. But let's just take a 10-minute bathroom break and then continue. Okay?
What? Oh, it's 10-minute break. And then it goes till actually a little while longer, 12:30. And, it's 11. So 11 to 10.
Like it?
Yeah, it's she's explaining it's for beginners.
family first constellation I did, you had to just jump in. And once you broke through that once, that was it. But I haven't done that with groups online. I'm good at this stuff. More than technical, and so, I asked about this example that I mentioned to you. She remembers this really well. This woman whose house she was playing, and how she was playing an instrument, playing awesome. So she came over here and she says, I'm not, I want to bring up my kids in this way, that was there. So she's here, and then the daughter was there, who was a mess. He was so depressed. She went 55. So it was passed down. Even though it wasn't one, right? And then the son, her grandson, picks up the child. 32. So they're just also so deep. It's just me. Very well is that we're not here for ourselves. For the mother. Well, I just want to. So go on, whatever you're doing. Go on. You're in the middle, like you're in the middle of the doorway. It feels to me like you want to go, but you thought you don't know. Let's see. Go forward. Good. Good. Yeah, I like it.
You know, everything is so often, this is Jadina actually speaking, everything is so connected all the time. So I'm looking outside here and it's frozen snow, you know, and I'm feeling that like,
Yeah.
all right. And then just now the, what are they, the snow, the ones that come and, what are they called? That push the snow, what are they? Plow.
Go plow.
The plow's coming and just pushing it away. And I'm like, oh, thank you.
Are we all back? I can't see you guys. That's the weird thing about these PowerPoints. How's it looking, Maya? Are we kind of here or not?
Not everybody has put on their cameras, so I'm not sure if they're back.
Will you tell me when folks look like they're back? Because I can happily continue.
Looks like most people are coming back. If you're here, if you can quickly put on your camera, even if you want to take your camera off, that would be really great, so we can make sure we've got most everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think we've got everybody back. It's two people who I'm not sure about. MB, Ellen.
Okay, this
here,
is
I'm
Ellen.
sorry.
This is Ellen. I'm back.
Here, great,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, sorry, this is MB. I had said I was back in the chat. Apologize.
No problem, no problem.
As long as everybody's back, we're great. Okay, thank you.
So it's a little like flying blindly here. All I see is the PowerPoint. So,
Yeah, thank
so
you. We're ready.
thanks, Maya. So I would love to kind of get through the PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask you to hold your questions now for a few minutes. So then we can do little questions and answers, but I'd really also love to give you an experience. So it's not all the mental understanding, if that's possible. So let's see, gonna go to this one. Just very briefly, what kind of stuff gets passed down through the generations? And before I go into this, a lot of wonderful things get passed down through the generations. So please don't, this is just the parts that aren't wonderful. So of course we receive a lot of help from our family systems, our DNA, our physical appearance, our talents, our support, the love we receive. So when we talk about the negatives, it sometimes sounds like it's very, very dark out here, but there's a lot of light that gets passed down in every family system, because mostly it's love that passes through the family systems. And then there are the hungry ghosts. And that's kind of what we work with. That's why there's so much emphasis on that part of what gets passed down. And as we already said, it's mostly what could not complete its process. Because if something happened, it was processed, it was dealt with, it was gone, forgiven, let go, it will not move forward, it's finished. But that which is not complete gets somehow stuck and becomes a shadow. And that's what we work with. We've already said a lot of these things are secrets, family secrets, or hidden events that we're often too ashamed to share, or we want to protect our next generation from these things. So those kind of underlying energetic processes that are sitting there, they will be picked up by future generations. Or sometimes it's a death that wasn't grieved, a betrayal that wasn't worked through, not forgiven. Very often we work with people who were excluded from the family. That is a very common place where future generations will become entangled. And that's, we always work with entanglements, because then the generation who comes later will bring that person back. That energetic process that wasn't completed comes back. So they may act like this person, or have a habit like this person, or do exactly the opposite of this person, but that energetic charge lands in a future generation and gets worked with there. Sometimes disconnection, like immigration, can be a big issue, like in the potato famine constellation that I shared with you. That disconnection from the homeland and the mother was a major cut in the flow of love through the generations. So we work with that. And also frequently there are perpetrator and victim dynamics that are not reconciled. And that doesn't always have to be as horrendous as the Holocaust. It can be someone stole from you, or someone hurt you, or you hurt someone, that kind of a dynamic that leaves a residue that's not completed. So those are some of the typical things we look for in constellations. So this is an image. I'm going to do this as briefly as I can, so we have more time for the experiential. But this also will answer the past life question, because what we work with at all times in this life is this moment here in the middle, the presence, to be really present in this very moment. That means that the presence is always informed from things from the past. Our DNA is information that comes to the presence from the past. We have these pathways, these informations, these well-tested survival strategies. All of that comes into our present moment from the past as a resource, something we can draw on. And if all is well in the present moment, we can be guided by the future. We can be guided through inspiration that creativity has, or intuition, where we know what's right for us to do, or even that element of grace that comes in as a larger field that allows us to open and expand. So that's where we like to be in the present moment. What we work with in constellations is this little box on the right here, which is the not finished process. And as all trauma does, what hasn't been completed, it needs to repeat itself. It comes around again with the hope that this time as I come around, maybe we can complete this cycle. And that is where you suddenly see that, oh my God, my grandfather did that, my father does it, and now my son does it. There's something repeating itself. And then we know there is something that isn't finished. So that's one way of knowing it may be part of a family issue. And as it repeats itself, it now ends up again in this present moment. And that's why when we interview someone, we always look for what is arriving in this present moment. That's an issue that prevents you from being fully lit up and listening to intuition, grace, and inspiration. What is sort of holding you, anchoring you back somewhere in the past that we could help you clear? And there we look. Where is it sitting? Is it something that happened in your individual lifetime? So is it individual trauma? Like if your mother dies when you're 3, that's an individual trauma that probably has big impact on your present moment if you haven't been able to really embody that and work that through and process that. So then we work with that. Or is it something that lives in your family system, in your ancestry, that hasn't been cleared, right? So then we look at, what is this thing in my present moment that doesn't allow me to ever find a partner? Let's see, what is that doesn't allow me to find a partner, for example. And there's nothing in my personal life that I can think of that had that impact on me. But we look in the family system, and there is an excluded person who, whatever, never had a partner, who lived alone all her life or his life. You know, we look for, where might this thing in your present moment originate? And when we find it, we can work with it. And it could also be that, because of course individuals grow in families, and families grows in a collective, in a culture, in a religion, in a country. So sometimes the issue sits in the collective. So World War II, you know, you didn't have that many choices. So this collective intensely influenced the family system. And so then we might work on all three levels here and see, where do we address this in the constellation. I have a little graph, let's see where that is, here, where you can see that's the layers of the field. Where are we working in this field? You know, are we in the individual circle, that is, and the group is usually what holds the work? Or are we in the ancestral, the family system? Or do we end up in the collective cycle, or even further out in these bigger expansive fields? And I won't go further into that to save some more time here. But one thing you could do is sit down at some point and just sit with these three bubbles. My individual, unresolved. What could be unresolved in my family? And what's unresolved in our collective? Just to get a little idea of, what might I be sitting with in my unconscious? And
Samveda,
yeah,
this is Susie. Can I ask you a question?
mm-hmm.
Can a past event that happened between, you know, a set of people and that gets passed down, can that also express itself on a different plane, say in the symptomology of one person, rather than that person repeating that same pattern with, you know, in a similar sort of arrangement? Can it also express itself in that different form?
Absolutely. We do a lot of work. There are people who specialize in this work, where you look at the symptom, the physical symptom, as a messenger to something unresolved. So it can absolutely become a physical symptom. It can become a habit. It can become, you know, whatever form it takes, the unresolved will kind of knock on your door and say, I'm here. Either physically, emotionally, through an issue in your life. You know, it can take many forms.
Thank you.
Yeah. And most of the time, when we look at that symptom, we land in one of those three bubbles. Once in a blue moon, we actually land in something that is more past life related. And then there is a particular way to work with that in a different style of a past life constellation, which I'm not going to go into here. But I would say in 90% of all cases, whatever is in our presence right now is from this, one of these three bubbles. And that's where we look.
If I can just ask a quick question, this is Ellen. So if the client comes in and works through this family constellation and clears the unresolved issues from prior ancestral issues, but the intervening people still haven't gotten cleared, does it still work for the person who comes to see you, even if the intermediary people are potentially still stuck with that family trauma?
Right. So interestingly enough, think of it more like, you know, when you do that piece of work, it's a drop in that pond and it will ripple. It may not ripple instantaneously, But I can't tell you how often I've seen systems shift when we did this kind of work. That it's not just, you're not just working for this one person who has this trauma sitting in them. You're working for this system. You're working for this whole energetic system, and it affects the whole energetic system. And how much it opens people up, it's kind of like, are they able to allow that to happen? But I have so often seen change in family systems when one person did the work. It's very rare that the whole family shows up, you know? I had that too. I had a family with 5 siblings show up around an issue. It was very interesting because they didn't all have the same experience. Like 5 siblings will have different experiences. And I let the eldest set it up. And it worked very well for the first 4. And the 5th had a very different issue that was brought in that had nothing to do with any of the other issues. So you start seeing that not everybody has the same experience in the family system. But yes, if you do the work and you clear it, it ripples through the system and it changes the system. Okay, let's go on here. Okay, so this is a beautiful piece of art made by one of our team members, Julie Zobel. She's an artist, and she's helped us make some of the teachings visually beautiful. And so here is a little bit what we have found in the constellation works, and I'm going to keep that really brief because again, that could be a whole talk in itself. Most of you know that the work was initiated by Bert Hellinger, a German gentleman who was first a missionary for the Zulus. He was a Catholic priest and then became a psychologist and brought a lot of what he learned from the indigenous people into this work. And he called what he found the orders of love. And basically, we've already spoken about it. This is the love that goes through the family system. You see in the corner up there are the ancestors standing by and just sending their love into the flow of this river. And basically, families are built on this kind of love. Most parents dearly love their children. And sometimes there are interruptions to that love, and that's what we're looking for in the work. And I'm just going to very briefly talk to 3 principles here. We've already talked about belonging. That's the first one on the bottom there, which means that everyone who is born into a family system has the same right to belong to it. And if someone gets excluded, that leads to entanglements, which means a later generation will bring that person back into the family system by feeling the way they felt, by acting the way they acted. Somehow that person gets brought back home. So that's one of the works we do in the constellations to see if there's excluded people that we can bring back in. The second one is that there actually is a kind of hierarchy. We call it an order more than a hierarchy, but it means that each person that has been on the planet longer gets a higher position in the system. That means the elders should be honored because they're the eldest, and the youngest should stay in their place because they're the youngest. And often there is a mix-up in that order, which leads to difficulties because now the love doesn't flow forwards through the generation, but all of a sudden a child turns around because a parent can't love. There's a hurt, there's a wounding, and now the child pours all their love into the parent and helps heal the parent, which is probably helpful here, but then the love can't flow forward to children of that child. So we try to repair the orders of love so that love flows from grandmother to mother to daughter, so it moves through the generations in the right order and not crisscross the other way. And that doesn't mean we can't help our elders or any of that. It's not that simple. But I'm going to leave it here as just a simple order of love. It flows the best when it goes through the right order of birth. And then there is the last one that I'm also just going to touch on very little, which is that love flows best when there is a balance in giving and taking in relationships. A healthy human relationship is a balance, an exchange. I receive and I give. If they get polarized, that's usually doesn't allow love to grow very well. With the only exception that, of course, between parents and children, the parent gives, the child receives. That's the normal order of love there. And then this little sentence of fate is a matter for the soul, which means in this order, what we all encounter on this planet, what our lives unfold like, that is a much larger issue. And we all have our own that we bring into this. All we can do is help let love flow the best through that system and through that fate, and help people to respect and honor and acknowledge the fate of the ancestors and their own. So lastly, what do we do when we try to restore love? I think by now you kind of got the idea that we are retracing and unpacking family dynamics in a safe and attuned environment. None of this opens if we don't feel safe and well held. That's why we most of the time do this in group work, where we do some good attunement to each other, create a safe space, and then help each other to look at what's here in my family system. That's the resourcing. The group becomes a wonderful container that says, I'll help you, I'll step into your family and get a flavor for what that's like and help you move that, and you help me. And we can also source through other powerful resources, part of nature. As Annie was saying, we're trying to work with the horses and see how they can attune, which is a wonderful experiment. And just to make this a little bigger than just our human dilemma here, this is also a planetary issue right now and a climate issue. It's bigger than just us. But all, in the family work, we're working with integrating the disowned choices, things that we couldn't own. And we need to feel them, understand them in a safe relational field. This is also important because trauma happens very often in the absence of a safe relational field. And it can only be unpacked in a safe relational field. So that's a very important thing to establish. And so I end with my wonderful image that I really love and often use, and with the understanding that none of us walk alone. And what you're looking at is a picture that was taken in South Africa at the Dagara tribe. And it is an eldest member of this community greeting the newborn, the newest member of this community. And they, excuse me, they have that tradition that the eldest hangs out with the newborn for the first while of their life, because they believe in the cyclical nature of all life. And so the newborn is just entering this lifetime, coming out of the great mystery into this lifetime. And the elder is getting ready to step out into the great mystery. So they believe that when the elder is with the newborn and listens really attunedly and carefully, there might be a message that comes through the newborn to the elder, how he or she can most gracefully complete life and step back out into the mystery. So there is a way that generations listen with great care and love and attunement. And that's what we're hoping to reestablish in our family systems, that kind of listening.